The map had promised a simple weekend hike through the Whispering Pines Trail. Now, as dusk settled over the canopy, the 5 friends found themselves standing in a circle of confusion, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness like desperate prayers. Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped the paper that had led them astray, while Marcus watched his compass needle spin lazily, mocking their predicament. The forest had grown eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, and every familiar landmark had vanished into the maze of towering pines. They had been walking for hours, yet somehow remained exactly where they had started, trapped in a labyrinth of bark and shadow that seemed to shift and breathe around them. Elena pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient pine, her breath coming in short gasps that fogged in the evening air. The others were calling her name, their voices muffled by the oppressive silence that had settled over the forest like a shroud. She could feel the weight of the trees pressing in from all sides, their endless rows stretching beyond the reach of her flashlight's beam. The rational part of her mind knew forests didn't actually close in on people, but every step backward seemed to lead to a new thicket of brambles and fallen logs. Her water bottle felt impossibly light now, and she realized with growing dread that they had been walking in circles for hours, each path looking identical to the last in the fading light. The fog rolled in like a living thing, swallowing their footprints and erasing any trace of the path they had been following just minutes before. David's compass had stopped working entirely now, its needle frozen in a direction that led nowhere, and he found himself wondering if the device had been cursed from the moment they entered this cursed wood. His companions were scattered around the clearing, each one lost in their own private panic, calling out to voices that never answered. The moon hung like a pale eye above them, barely piercing the canopy of branches that seemed to reach down and snatch at their hope with skeletal fingers. Every tree looked identical, every shadow held the promise of deeper darkness, and the silence had become so complete that they could hear their own hearts beating in the hollow spaces between their breaths. The flashlight beam danced wildly as Emma's hands shook, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. She had only stepped away for a moment, just long enough to tie her boot, but when she looked up the others had vanished into the hungry darkness. Now she stood alone in a cathedral of pines, their trunks so thick that 3 people couldn't encircle them, stretching up into blackness that seemed infinite. Each step forward felt like a betrayal, as if the forest was testing her resolve, and every new clearing looked exactly like the one before. The silence pressed against her eardrums like water, and she could swear she heard whispers in languages that had no business existing in any modern wood. Her throat was dry, her legs ached, and the rational part of her mind was beginning to fray at the edges like old cloth. They had stopped moving hours ago, their bodies finally acknowledging what their minds had been refusing to accept. The clearing where they now sat felt like a prison cell, surrounded by walls of ancient oak and pine that seemed to press closer with each passing moment. James stared into the middle distance, his eyes reflecting the pale moonlight like a cornered animal, while the others nursed their dwindling water supplies and tried not to think about tomorrow. The forest had won, it seemed, not through violence but through patient manipulation, leading them deeper with each desperate attempt to escape. Every landmark they thought they recognized turned out to be an imposter, every shortcut led to thicker undergrowth, and the trail markers they sought had simply ceased to exist in this part of the wood where logic went to die. The walking stick snapped in his grip like a wishbone, the sharp crack echoing through the silence and making them all jump. Michael dropped the pieces and backed against a tree trunk so wide he couldn't wrap his arms around it, his chest heaving as panic clawed at his throat. The forest had been playing games with them, he realized, leading them in spirals that grew tighter and more desperate with each passing hour. Every path upward led to a dead end, every valley held only more trees, and the stars above seemed to have shifted into unfamiliar constellations. His friends were calling to each other in voices that sounded thin and far away, and he wondered if they were all slowly going mad together, lost in a wood that existed in some space between reality and nightmare. Dawn broke like a wound across the sky, painting the mist in shades of gold and crimson that should have been beautiful but felt ominous instead. Rebecca's knees buckled as she leaned against a tree, the bark rough against her palm, and she wondered if her legs would carry her much further. The map in her hands was useless now, reduced to pulp by sweat and rain, and she couldn't remember the last time she had seen anything that looked like a trail marker. They had been walking all night, driven by desperation and the false hope that movement might lead to salvation, but the forest had simply absorbed their efforts like a sponge. Her companions were scattered somewhere in the fog, their voices growing more distant with each passing hour, and she began to suspect that they were not just lost but actively unwelcome in this ancient wood that had no intention of letting them leave. The flashlight batteries were dying, their beams growing weaker with each step, and Olivia knew they were following her like condemned prisoners following their executioner. Her legs moved mechanically, one foot in front of the other, while her mind drifted in and out of coherence. The forest had become a maze designed by someone who delighted in human suffering, every turn leading to new impossibilities and every clearing offering only more trees. They had tried everything, from marking trees with knives to following streams that led nowhere, and the forest had responded by shifting its layout like a living thing. The others barely spoke now, their voices hoarse from calling out to each other in the dark, and she wondered if they were all slowly becoming part of the wood itself, destined to wander its paths for eternity. Thomas stopped breathing entirely for a moment, his flashlight beam frozen on something in the distance that made his blood turn to ice water. The others bumped into him before they saw it too, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than any scream. In the clearing ahead of them, where they had hoped to find rest and perhaps a way out, stood dozens of their own footprints arranged in perfect circles that spiraled outward like some terrible mandala. They had been walking in ever-widening loops, drawn back to this spot again and again by forces that had no business existing in any natural wood. The realization hit them all at once that they were not lost because they had made mistakes, but because the forest itself was alive and hungry, and it had been playing with them like a cat plays with mice. The fog had grown thick enough to swallow them whole, and Jonathan pressed his companions closer together as if human warmth could protect them from what was coming. The compass in his hand had cracked down the middle, its face showing directions that didn't exist, and he realized with crystalline clarity that they had never been hiking through any ordinary forest. The trees around them were too old, too perfectly arranged, and the silence held a quality that suggested intelligence rather than mere absence of sound. They had stumbled into something ancient and awake, something that fed on fear and confusion, and every attempt to leave had only made it more determined to keep them. As the mist swirled around their ankles like grasping fingers, they understood that they were no longer tourists who had gotten lost, but guests at a feast that had been waiting for them since the first humans wandered away from the safety of their fires.